Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Ibogaine and the suppression of the most effective addiction-interrupting molecule ever identified.
Yeah, this is a heavy one, but so incredibly necessary to talk about.
It really is because, well, I want you to imagine you are a 35-year-old Marine veteran, right?
Yep.
You survive these grueling combat deployments, serving your country, only to come home and get handed a prescription pill bottle by the VA.
Right, which essentially starts a completely different, often deadlier war inside your own body.
Exactly. And that is the reality for Kyle DeMasso. He's a mechanic and a veteran, featured in a recent Wall Street Journal documentary we're looking at. His opioid addiction became so severe, and the conventional medical system failed him so profoundly that he had to literally pack his bags, drive from the U.S., and cross an international border to a clinic in Tijuana, Mexico.
Just to get his life back. I mean, he risked his freedom stepping totally outside U.S. law.
Yeah. So today, we are auditing the architecture of exactly why Kyle had to make that drive, why a profound biological cure has been sitting in a central West African jungle for centuries, while the pharmaceutical pipeline filled graves here at home. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the foundation of this narrative, we kind of have to undergo a complete shift in our geographic and scientific perspective, because we aren't starting in some sterile laboratory or a corporate boardroom in the West.
Right.
We are starting in the soil of the Congo Basin, specifically in Gabon and Cameroon. The source of this molecule is a perennial rainforest shrub called Tabernanthe iboga.
And visually, it's pretty unremarkable, right? Just small yellow flowers, orange fruit.
Yeah, exactly. But beneath the soil, the pale yellow root bark contains this astonishingly complex chemistry. And for centuries, the Bwiti people of Gabon have utilized this root bark not as a drug, but as a profound sacrament.
And it's crucial to emphasize how they use it, because it is explicitly not recreational. They use it for this rigorous initiation rite that marks the transition from childhood to adulthood. They translate the experience as the break of the head.
Wow. Break of the head. That's intense.
Oh, it is. Let's really picture what this entails. It involves ingesting a massive quantity of the shaved root bark, which plunges the initiate into a grueling 36-hour confrontation with themselves.
A literal trial by fire.
Exactly, conducted entirely inside the skull. The initiate views their life from the outside, confronting their ancestors and, like, the crushing weight of their own choices. The Bwiti understood the human nervous system in a way Western science is only just beginning to quantify.
Yeah, and the chemistry of that root bark reflects that depth. It contains at least 12 distinct alkaloids, with the primary actor being ibogaine. Structurally, it's an indole alkaloid with a tryptamine backbone.
Let me jump in right there, because that can sound a bit like a chemistry textbook.
Fair point.
If you were listening and wondering what a tryptamine backbone actually means in practice, it essentially makes Ibogaine a chemical cousin to neurotransmitters like serotonin and to classical psychedelics like DMT.
That's a perfect way to translate it. It belongs to that family, but its true uniqueness lies in its physical three-dimensional shape. Pharmacologists classify it as a cage compound.
I've always thought about it this way. Think of most pharmaceutical drugs like a standard house key. They are manufactured to fit one specific lock, targeting one specific receptor in the brain.
Right, a very narrow target.
But looking at Ibogaine's physical cage structure, it's like a master key. It walks into the brain and unlocks every door in the building at the exact same time. It has this incredible multi-target affinity.
Which is incredible.
But this brings up a massive historical question. We know French explorers observed Bwiti hunters using small doses for physical endurance in the late 19th century. By 1901, two French chemists isolated the primary alkaloid and successfully marketed it in France as a minor fatigue tonic named Lambarine. So how did the entire Western medical establishment isolate this master key, put it in a commercial bottle, and completely miss the neurochemical revolution hidden inside it?
Well, what's fascinating here is how deeply cultural and institutional bias blinded 20th century science to a native sacrament's actual utility.
They just weren't looking for it, were they?
Not at all. The Western medical paradigm at the turn of the century was seeking a simple stimulant. They wanted a chemical to increase labor productivity. They were absolutely not looking for a molecule that triggered a profound 36-hour psychological reset.
Right.
And because the commercial doses of lamberine they were selling were far too small to induce the visionary state, the medical establishment just encountered a minor tonic, filed it away as uninteresting, and the Combo Basin kept the true secret of the root hidden from the West for another 60 years.
So you have this incredibly powerful jungle sacrament sitting perfectly ignored by European doctors. How does it finally make its way into Western addiction medicine? The answer is, well, by complete accident.
A total fluke.
The timeline shifts from the African rainforest to a Staten Island apartment in 1962. A 19-year-old heroin addict named Howard Lotsof was simply looking for a new high. A chemist acquaintance handed him a dose of Ibogaine.
And Lotsof took it and was unexpectedly thrown into that 36-hour third-person review of his life.
Yeah, he saw the childhood trauma that drove him to heroin. He observed the mechanics of his own addiction from an external perspective, totally detached from his ego. But the real miracle wasn't the vision. The critical moment came when he woke up.
He woke up to a phenomenon that the literature vividly describes as pharmacological silence.
Let's talk about the visceral reality of that silence. Anyone who has witnessed heroin withdrawal knows it is absolute physical agony. The bone-deep pain, the sweating, the intense vomiting, the restless legs.
It's horrific.
Lotsof wakes up, and there is zero withdrawal, zero craving. He looked at his heroin kit and felt absolutely nothing.
No need to white-knuckle it with willpower.
Exactly. Just an empty space where the compulsion used to dominate his entire existence. He immediately gave the compound to 7 of his friends, all of whom were heavily addicted to heroin. 5 of them stopped using entirely after a single session.
Completely bypassed the detox wards, the methadone clinics, the agonizing 12-step cycles. Lotsof realized he possessed something that defied the entire medical consensus on addiction.
He realized he had a biological interrupt switch.
Yeah. And he dedicated the rest of his life to this molecule. He filed patents, founded the Global Classification Network, relentlessly lobbied the National Institute on Drug Abuse, yet he was entirely ignored by the establishment.
Because he was just a lemon, right?
Right. A former addict with a high school education, challenging a multi-billion-dollar medical machine that had absolutely no financial incentive to explore a one-dose cure.
And his timing could not have been worse. The late 1960s ushered in Nixon's war on drugs. By 1970, the Controlled Substances Act placed Ibogaine into Schedule I, which is the most restrictive legal classification possible.
And Schedule I requires a substance to have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
I have to push back on the sheer absurdity of this legal framework. How can a drug that induces 8 hours of intense, often terrifying hallucinations, accompanied by severe physical discomfort and a total loss of muscle control, possibly be classified as having a high potential for abuse?
It makes no sense.
Literally no one is taking a grueling 36-hour psychological ordeal recreationally on a Friday night at a party.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1970 scheduling was never a scientific determination. The law didn't care about the actual pharmacology or the complete lack of a recreational user base. The law wanted total control.
Right.
That scheduling was the legislative architecture of criminalizing consciousness. Ibogaine was simply caught in the massive dragnet designed to target LSD and heroin, and it has been trapped in that legal vault for 56 years.
Despite that federal ban, the data coming out of underground and international clinics like the one Kyle DeMassa went to forces us to confront the undeniable physical hardware changes occurring in the brain.
Yeah, to understand the gravity of what Ibogaine does, you first have to understand the grim neurobiology of chronic opioid use.
How it hijacks the brain.
Exactly. Opioids hijack the brain's reward signaling by flooding a region called the nucleus accumbens with dopamine. The brain adapts to this unnatural, massive flood by downregulating its own dopamine production and physically reducing its number of dopamine receptors.
Think of it like a city managing a flood. The brain essentially builds smaller and smaller cisterns to handle the excess water.
That's a great analogy. And when you finally remove the opioid, the user doesn't just return to a normal, healthy baseline. They plummet into a state of severe dopaminergic depletion.
The reward circuitry is fundamentally burnt out.
Yeah. Basic human joys, food, sunlight, human connection, none of it registers anymore. The only thing that provides relief from that crushing darkness is the drug itself. This is not a failure of willpower or a moral failing. It is a measurable physical neurological deficit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Ibogaine addresses this deficit through a dual mechanism that has absolutely no parallel in modern pharmacy.
Right.
Wait, so if a patient takes this, the severe withdrawal just stops? How is that physically possible when their receptors are completely burned out?
That's the brilliance of the dual mechanism. First, it acts as a non-competitive antagonist at the NMDA receptors. These receptors are essentially the gates for glutamate, which is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay, so it blocks those gates.
Exactly. By blocking them, Ibogaine halts the excitotoxic overactivation that causes the physical agony of withdrawal. It chemically interrupts the acute physical withdrawal, the cramping, the sweating, the panic within hours.
But stopping the withdrawal is only half the battle. What about the burnt-out reward system?
That is the second mechanism, and it's what elevates Ibogaine from a mere treatment to a total paradigm shift. It is a potent agonist of the sigma-2 receptor.
And what happens when it binds there?
It triggers the massive release of GDNF, which stands for glial cell line-derived neurotrophic factor. GDNF is essentially the holy grail of addiction neuroscience.
Right, it's a highly specialized protein that promotes the survival and rapid growth of dopaminergic neurons.
Exactly. Ibogaine doesn't just block a craving signal, it physically regenerates the reward pathway that the addiction destroyed. In animal models, after Ibogaine administration, subjects completely lost interest in morphine because the neurological need for it had been structurally repaired at the cellular level.
Dr. Kenneth Alper of NYU, who is a leading researcher in this field, is very precise with his terminology here. He refuses to call Ibogaine a cure. Instead, he calls it a negative pattern interrupter.
Which makes sense.
It does not replace one chemical dependency with another, like methadone or Suboxone does. It creates a profound window of neurological silence. What you do with that window is up to you, but the window itself is physically very real.
And the clinical experience of stepping through that window unfolds in 3 distinct phases over those 36 hours. Phase 1 is the visionary state.
Right, the intense part.
For about 8 hours, the patient undergoes a massive disruption of the default mode network. That's the brain network responsible for your narrative self, your ego, and the rigid rumination loops that sustain addiction. Disrupting this manifests as that panoramic autobiographical review.
And phase 2.
Phase 2 is evaluative, where the intense visions recede and the patient quietly processes the psychological confrontation they just experienced. Phase 3 is residual stimulation, a state of alert wakefulness where the brain is actively producing that GDNF and physically rebuilding its circuitry.
The real-world results of this process are staggering. Observational studies from gray market clinics show 50 to 60% of opioid-dependent patients remain completely abstinent at 12 months. Wow. Compare that to conventional treatments, which hover around a dismal 10 to 30% success rate. But the data that truly shattered the institutional silence came from Stanford University in 2023, published in the highly respected journal Nature Medicine.
The veteran study.
Yes. Researchers tracked 30 special operations veterans who traveled to Mexico for Ibogaine treatment. The outcomes were unprecedented: an 88% drop in PTSD symptoms, an 87% drop in depression, and an 81% decrease in anxiety.
We have to remember who these subjects are. These veterans were not reporting a vague, mystical, feel-good experience. They reported measurable, structural, functional restoration. The special operations community does not operate on wishful thinking. They went to Mexico because the medical system that sent them to war offered them nothing but handfuls of pills when they returned broken. And functional restoration, backed by hard data, is the only language that institutional medicine is forced to respect.
Which brings us to the tragic financial architecture of addiction in this country. If the neurobiology is this demonstrably superior, why was it ignored and suppressed for so long?
The answer lies entirely in pharmaceutical economics.
The current immensely profitable business model of addiction medicine is chronic management. Methadone is dispensed daily. Insurance is billed daily. Private equity firms currently control 562 methadone clinics across America.
The numbers are wild. A 20-year methadone patient costs the healthcare system between $150,000 and $300,000.
Right.
In stark contrast, an Ibogaine treatment is a one-time exit from that billing cycle, costing between $5,000 and $15,000 in a licensed clinic.
From a purely financial standpoint, full recovery terminates the revenue stream. And the institutional defense mechanism against this massive financial threat has been the exaggeration of safety risks. Now, to be clear, Ibogaine does carry genuine cardiac risks.
Yeah, we have to acknowledge that.
It uniquely prolongs the QT interval, which is the electrical recovery period of the heartbeat. Without proper medical screening, this can trigger a fatal arrhythmia. However, context is absolutely vital here. Over the last 30 years, there have been approximately 30 deaths attributed to Ibogaine worldwide.
30.
In that exact same 30-year window, opioids killed over 500,000 Americans.
That ratio is just staggering.
Think about it. It's like the medical industry was presented with a choice: buy a $10,000 fire extinguisher or pay a $200,000 subscription to sit in a chair and watch the building burn down. They eagerly chose the subscription.
They really did.
The FDA's risk calculus treats Ibogaine as too dangerous to even properly research, while simultaneously approving and distributing the very opioid drugs that ignited the epidemic in the first place.
This raises an important question regarding the nature of prohibition itself. By keeping Ibogaine locked in Schedule 1, the government effectively forced desperate patients into an unregulated underground clinic network.
Right, they removed the safety nets.
Exactly. They stripped away the vital medical infrastructure required to make it safe, mandatory EKG monitoring, ACLS-trained medical staff, comprehensive cardiac screening. The prohibition manufactured the exact danger it cited to justify the ban.
It's totally backwards.
It is the identical legislative logic that produced the xylazine and fentanyl crises. Criminalize the substance, force it into the shadows, watch the mortality rate multiply, and then use those bodies as evidence that the substance is too dangerous to regulate.
Before we move on, as a reminder to you listening, the sources we're reviewing mention specific political figures and recent legislation from both sides of the aisle. We are strictly reporting the timeline and data provided in the text, not endorsing any political party, figure, or platform.
Right, exactly.
Now, that political fortress that held firm for 56 years is finally cracking, driven by an undeniable death toll and that staggering veteran data out of Stanford. On April 18, 2026, President Trump signed an executive order allocating $50 million in federal funds to fast-track clinical trials for psychedelics, specifically including Ibogaine.
It's huge. While it currently remains Schedule 1, this order represents a massive tectonic structural shift in policy.
And it's important to note that this shift actually began gaining momentum at the state level. In June 2025, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed Senate Bill 2308, allocating $50 million for FDA-supervised Ibogaine trials led by UHealth Houston and UTMB Health.
Yeah, and Mississippi advanced House Bill 314 to study its effects on neurological conditions. Colorado introduced HB 263325 for an Ibogaine research pilot program.
And Vermont Senate Health Committee passed Senate Bill 77 with a unanimous 10-0 vote, appropriating $21 million over 2 years to study Ibogaine for both addiction and PTSD. Notice the demographics of this legislative movement.
Right, if you think this is driven by the psychedelic counterculture, you are mistaken.
Absolutely. These are largely conservative states and highly organized veterans groups responding to a crisis that has absolutely decimated their communities, all while the pharmaceutical industry collected daily subscription fees. The special operations veterans brought the undeniable receipts from their own healed nervous systems.
But here is the critical pivot in the story. Big Pharma is now racing to commodify this movement. Companies like Ambio Life Sciences and MindMed are pouring millions into developing synthetic Ibogaine analogs.
Like Ibogaine, right?
Yeah, they are primarily targeting that active metabolite. Their stated goal is to engineer away the cardiac risk, which, as we discussed, is medically valid. But they also want to engineer away the visionary state. Doing so makes the new molecule patentable and highly profitable.
So what does this all mean? The pharmaceutical industry is trying to strip out the very psychological confrontation that the patients explicitly cite as a catalyst for their recovery. The researchers and patients argue fiercely that the 8-hour visionary state is not an unwanted side effect of the neurochemistry. It is the neurochemistry doing exactly what it was designed to do. You cannot heal a psychological wound that you refuse to look at, and Ibogaine forces the patient to look.
The structural irony of this moment is staggering. The pharmaceutical industry actively suppressed the natural root for 50 years because they could not patent and profit from a plant that grows in Gabon.
Yep.
Now that the clinical data is simply too loud to ignore, they are racing to patent a synthetic, sanitized version that bypasses the traditional Bwiti sacrament entirely. They are trying to extract the molecular mechanism of healing while deliberately discarding the deep psychological exorcism that makes a recovery permanent.
This entire deep dive is a profound indictment of a broken medical system. Think back to Kyle DeMasso, a Marine veteran carrying the heavy trauma of his service, falls into a severe addiction born entirely from American pharmaceuticals.
The VA gives him pills that become the problem.
Exactly. The system designed to catch him instead contains him in a perpetual cycle of chronic management. To save his own life, he had to cross an international border and commit a federal crime just to access a West African root bark that has been used safely by the Bwiti for centuries. The molecule that actually cured his addiction sits in the exact same legal category as the fentanyl that was killing him.
If a multi-billion-dollar medical industry spent half a century prioritizing chronic management subscriptions over a functional cellular-level cure for the deadliest drug crisis in modern history, we have to ask what other life-saving master key molecules are currently locked away in Schedule 1, just waiting for the political math to finally shift.
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.